The belly of the mass conveyor Emperor's Repose is a cathedral of rust and shadows. Thousands of souls are packed into the iron ribs of the lower decks, breathing the same exhausted atmosphere. The air is a heavy, choking miasma. It reeks of endlessly recycled oxygen, the sharp chemical tang of promethium sweat, and the coppery, inescapable stench of old blood baked into flak armor. This is the realm of the surviving veterans of the 144th Viridian Regiment. They are ghosts wrapped in rags and dented ceramite, their bodies scarred by 100 brutal campaigns. Yet beneath the grime and the exhaustion, a fragile, almost Xenos emotion ripples through the gloom. It is hope. In the dim lumens of the transit bay sits Guardsman Elias. He is a man hollowed out by the meat grinder of war, his eyes carrying the ghosts of trenches that have long since been swallowed by mud and artillery fire. But in his scarred, calloused hands he holds a singular treasure. It is a faded, crease-worn pict capture. The photocard is frail, its edges curling and fraying from years of desperate handling. Elias runs a trembling thumb over the surface, the material worn perfectly smooth by the countless times he has sought its comfort in the pitch black of a screaming foxhole. The image is barely visible beneath the scuffs and the dirt, but he does not need his eyes to see it. He knows every line, every shadow. It is the face of his wife, Ilara, and the sleeping form of his infant daughter, Livia. They are his anchor to a reality that exists beyond the slaughter. Elias stares at the faint smiles trapped in the battered parchment, and a profound, aching warmth swells within his chest. It is a desperately human anticipation, burning bright and pure against the cold, uncaring iron of the great ship that carries him. He has survived. He has marched through lakes of fire and climbed mountains of the dead, offering his blood as a tithe to the God Emperor. He truly believes that the debt is paid. In his beautiful, tragic naivety, Elias believes he has finally earned his rest. He imagines the soft winds of his home world, the smell of real soil, and the warmth of a sun that does not hide behind clouds of ash. The horrors of the battlefield begin to recede, replaced by the quiet certainty that he will soon hold his family once more. A deep mechanical groan reverberates through the deck plating, shaking the dust from the overhead pipes. The immense engines of the conveyor are awakening from their slumber. Elias breathes a slow, shaky sigh of profound relief. He brings the worn pict capture to his cracked lips for a fleeting moment, a silent promise whispered into the dark. With a reverence usually reserved for holy relics, he carefully slides the photocard back into the reinforced breast pocket of his tunic, pressing it tight against his beating heart. Above him, the heavy thrum of the great void engines builds into a steady, rhythmic pulse. The grinding wail of the ship-wide claxons begins to echo down the long, metallic corridors, signaling the final, irreversible preparations for warp transit. To understand the true weight of Elias and the Viridian 144th returning home, one must first understand the fundamental mathematics of the Astra Militarum. To don the flak armor of the Imperial Guard is to accept a death sentence delayed only by the grace of the God Emperor and the width of a lasgun barrel. The vast, overwhelming majority of those tithed to the stars will never see their birth worlds again. They will die in the nameless mud of forgotten battlefields, their bodies reduced to ash and blood, their names struck from the ledgers of the Departamento Munitorum by unfeeling adepts. For a guardsman to survive their standard decades of service is a rare anomaly. For them to be granted the right of settlement, an ancient decree allowing a retiring regiment to colonize a conquered world, is a statistical impossibility. But for an entire regiment to be handed a return ticket to their exact world of origin, one must look to the realm of pure bureaucratic miracles. The administratum of terror processes the lives of trillions, crushing human hopes beneath mountains of stamped vellum and endless quotas. Yet, through some inexplicable alignment of clerical decrees, planetary tithe requirements, and the sheer mercy of the Golden Throne, the Viridian 144th was granted exactly that. They were not to be disbanded on some irradiated frontier or folded into a newly founded crusade. They were ordered back to Viridia Prime to serve as a veteran training cadre for the local planetary defense force. Within the worn canvas kit strapped to Elias lies a single sheet of heavy parchment that represents the culmination of this impossible triumph. It is his official discharge mandate, bearing the heavy crimson wax seal of a munitorum prefect. That single, fragile piece of paper carries more worth than a planetary governor's ransom. It is tangible proof that he has paid his toll in blood and survived the relentless meat grinder of the galaxy. Across the cavernous holds of the transport vessel, thousands of scarred veterans sit in a state of quiet, trembling reverence. Hardened killers who have stared down the horrors of the Xenos and the Heretic now gently cradle their discharge papers as though holding the sacred relics of Imperial martyrs. They trace the Gothic script of their own names, weeping silent tears over the official decrees that promise them peace. It is a beautiful, blinding hope that makes the inherent cruelty of the universe all the more agonizing. They are utterly unaware of the dark fate gathering in the shadows of the void. Beneath their booted feet, the colossal plasma drives of the troopship roar to life. The vessel slowly breaks orbit from the scorched war zone, its massive prow turning away from the light of the local star. With its precious cargo of triumphant, dreaming souls, the ship accelerates steadily toward the Mandeville Point, preparing to tear a jagged wound into the terrifying depths of the Empyrean. The order is given from the raised dais of the Strategium, and the ancient warp drives begin their catastrophic work. First comes the sacred, necessary ignition of the Geller field. Only once the protective wards are locked firmly in place is the very fabric of real space torn asunder before the ship, bleeding violent and unnatural spectrums of light across the heavy viewing ports. Deep within the lightless bowels of the vessel, arcane archaeotech thrums with furious divine power. Invisible waves of protective energy wash over the colossal adamantium hull, sealing the crew within a cocoon of sanity. To understand the true magnitude of this translation, one must understand the absolute hostility of the realm they now enter. The immaterium is not merely a dimension of spatial transit. It is a boiling infinite ocean of madness, an abyss composed entirely of raw emotion, untethered thought, and ravenous psychic predation. The Geller field operates by generating a localized bubble of reality, projecting a vanishingly thin skin of physical laws into a universe that despises order. Without this fragile, flickering barrier, the ship and every mortal soul aboard would be instantly dissolved and consumed by the unspeakable horrors that swim through the tides of the warp. Even with this miraculous shield locked firmly in place, the crossing is never truly clean. Baseline humans always suffer the sickening physical toll of tearing through the cosmic veil. A sudden crushing pressure builds behind the eyes of every man and woman aboard, as if the fragile human skull is rebelling against the immediate absence of reality. The heavy, unmistakable taste of blood and copper floods the mouth. Most unnerving of all are the faint, ghostly whisperings that seem to bleed directly through the cold, solid iron of the ship bulkheads. These phantom murmurs speak in tongues of ancient regret and unspoken sin, scratching incessantly at the very edge of mortal consciousness. Despite the unfathomable cosmic horror raging just millimeters beyond the outer hull, the atmosphere within the claustrophobic troop decks remains profoundly mundane. For the weary, enlisted guardsmen, this journey through a literal hell is a terrifying necessity endured only through rigid military routine. They huddle around battered munition crates, nervously playing endless hands of cards and exchanging meager wagers in a desperate bid to distract themselves from the whispers bleeding through the hull. Others sit in quiet, practiced focus, stripping down their dependable laser guns, diligently applying sacred machine unguents to focusing lenses and depleted power packs. From the tarnished, brass-rimmed voxcasters mounted along the vaulted ceilings, the droning, familiar hymns of the ecclesiarchy echo down the long, dim corridors. The soldiers of the Astra Militarum sing along in disjointed, weary harmony, their unified voices stubbornly masking the insidious scratches echoing from the outside of the hull. They are utterly relaxed, placing their complete and blind faith in the ancient, misunderstood machinery of the Emperor to deliver them safely to their destination. Shipboard time loses its meaning, and the monotonous routine of military transit lulls the entire regiment into a comforting, ignorant security. Then, amidst the singing and the shuffling of cards, the ambient thrum of the plasma drives pitches downward into a sickening, mournful drone. A sudden, unnatural frost begins to crawl across the riveted deck plating, and the flickering lumens above cast elongated shadows that somehow stretch just a fraction too far. The true horrors of the warp do not always announce themselves with the rending of adamantium or the shrieking of unborn nightmares. Sometimes damnation arrives with terrifying subtlety. Deep within the cavernous belly of the troop transport, the overhead lumen strips flickered. It was a singular, unnoteworthy stutter of pale yellow light, lasting no longer than the heartbeat of a dying man. In that imperceptible fraction of a moment, a sudden, bone-deep chill flooded the sprawling lower decks. It was a cold that did not merely banish warmth, but seemed to leach the very concept of heat from the stagnant air. For exactly 1 second, the exhaled breath of 10,000 resting guardsmen frosted into thick, crystalline plumes. The men merely shivered in the brief gloom and pulled their heavy grey greatcoats tighter around their hunched shoulders. They remained blissfully, tragically unaware that the icy breath of deep time had just brushed against their mortal souls. In the stuttering half-light of the bilges, the physical laws of the material universe briefly lost their iron grip. Shadows cast by the heavy bulkhead doors and the sleeping soldiers seemed to physically detach themselves from their casters. They lengthened unnaturally across the deck plating, stretching out like the grasping fingers of starved entities. Then, just as the lumen strips restored their steady hum, the shadows snapped violently back into their proper alignments. No alarm sounded to mark this impossibility. No klaxons wailed their warnings through the endless rusted corridors. There was only the rhythmic thrum of the ship's massive engines, continuing their relentless beat against the fragile skin of reality. High above the huddled masses of the Imperial Guard, the bridge remained a sanctuary of sacred incense and calculated certainty. Within the sanctum of the strategium, cowled engineers monitored the sprawling banks of the ancient Auspex arrays. Their brass auger dials and glowing green pick screens registered a sudden micro-fluctuation within the sacred geometry of the Geller field. It was a microscopic variance, an anomaly so small that it barely moved the blessed silver needles of their instruments. Bound by dogmatic rigidity and an inflexible adherence to their maintenance rituals, the tech priests made their fatal judgment. Chanting litanies of appeasement in monotonous binary cant, the masters of the machine cult dismissed the reading as a mere phantom echo of standard Empyrean turbulence. A minor mechanical hiccup was coldly catalogued, purged from the primary command hololiths, and instantly forgotten. The sheer scale of their ignorance was an absolute terror in itself. In their willful systemic blindness, the servants of the Omnissiah had entirely failed to recognize the severing of their chronal thread. The ship had not been breached by ravening demons, nor had its hull been compromised by the raw, mutating stuff of chaos. Instead, the vessel had quietly slipped from the time stream, unmoored entirely from the linear progression of the galaxy. The precise moment their eternal doom was sealed passed without ceremony or spectacle. The Voidborn crew simply returned to their menial tasks, confident in the absolute inviolability of their warding fields. As the great vessel pushed onward through the boiling, unnatural tides of the Immaterium, the illusion of safety remained completely intact. The remainder of the hellish journey unfolded with uneventful precision, belying the absolute damnation they now carried. Soon, the mandated duration of their warp translation would conclude. The navigators began the solemn, whispered rituals of realignment, preparing the mighty ship to tear its way back into the cold light of real space at their intended destination. To tear a mortal vessel from the clutches of the Empyrean is to subject it to the ultimate violence. At the Viridia Prime Mandeville Point, the immutable laws of physics reasserted their dominion over the troopship with the subtlety of a descending executioner's blade. The translation from the swirling, kaleidoscopic madness of the warp into the cold and unforgiving void of real space was an immediate and visceral shock. Gravity returned not as a gentle embrace, but as a crushing weight that drove thousands of souls to their knees in unison. A sickening, nauseating wave of vertigo washed through the labyrinthine lower decks, a violent physical toll that turned the stomachs of hardened veterans and fresh conscripts alike. The colossal adamantium spine of the transport let out a deafening, agonizing groan that vibrated through every rusted deck plate and reinforced bulkhead. It was the terrible sound of a wounded leviathan fighting to exist within the rigid, unyielding confines of reality once more. The brutal deceleration threw men against their restraints, rattling teeth and bruising flesh. For a terrifying moment, the lingering dissonance of their prior temporal slip echoed in their skulls, a fleeting phantom of displaced time that the crew willfully ignored in the face of their immediate survival. Then the violent shuddering finally ceased. The chaotic, warp-tainted hum of the Geller field generators spun down into a low, steady, comforting thrum. They had arrived. A collective sigh of profound relief swept through the cavernous staging areas, a massive exhalation washing away weeks of unvoiced terror. They had survived the hellish transit of the Immaterium intact. In the cramped, sweat-stained holds, weary men laughed and wept in sheer, unadulterated joy. It was the absolute zenith of human hope, a fleeting purity of spirit, born from the simple, glorious fact that they were still alive and finally home. Deep within the portside galleries, the massive, cogitator-driven gears of the armored blast shutters engaged with a heavy, rhythmic grind. The thick plasteel shields that had blinded the regiment to the clawing horrors of the warp began to slowly, agonizingly retract. Elias pushed his way to the front of the gathered crowd, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm of pure anticipation against his ribs. He pressed his bruised face directly against the cold, thick armor-glass of the observation port. His breath fogged the thick pain, but he quickly wiped it away with a trembling, calloused hand, desperate for his very first glimpse of home. In his mind, he was already picturing the breathtaking, unspoiled beauty of Viridia Prime. He fully expected to be greeted by the familiar, comforting hues of sapphire oceans, swirling white atmospheric storms, and deep emerald continents untouched by the unending galactic war. He was a loyal son, returning to a pristine cradle, surrounded by his cheering brothers in arms, ready to celebrate their triumphant homecoming. The heavy metal shutters continued their agonizingly slow crawl upward, millimeter by millimeter, peeling back the suffocating darkness of the ship. Every soldier held their breath as the sliver of distant starlight expanded into a wide panoramic view of the local system. Elias widened his eyes, a weary, desperate smile breaking through the grime and scar tissue on his face as the viewport finally cleared completely. The absolute silence of the void stretched out before them, revealing a towering vista that instantly paralyzed the cheering crowd. The heavy plasteel shutters of the observation deck grind open, revealing the void beyond. Elias stands at the forefront, a broad smile etching his weary features as he awaits the welcoming embrace of home. In his mind, Viridia Prime is a jewel of verdant continents and azure oceans, a quiet frontier world untouched by the sprawling horrors of the wider galaxy. He expects the gentle rotation of a solitary silver orbital defense platform. He anticipates the soft guiding glow of a couple of modest docking halos awaiting their triumphant return. Instead, the light that spills onto the bridge is the jaundiced, sickening glare of a world suffocated by its own industry. The smile slowly dies on Elias's face, replaced by a profound, paralyzing dread. Viridia Prime is gone. In its place hangs a swollen, blackened sphere of hyper-industrialized misery. The green continents and vast blue oceans have been entirely swallowed by sprawling grey hive cities that spread across the crust like a necrosis. These monolithic spires of rockcrete and steel scrape the upper atmosphere, glowing from within with a sickly amber luminescence that bleeds through the smog like festering wounds. The skies are choked with the ash of 10,000 manufactorums, forever burning the bones of the world to feed an insatiable hunger. The modest docking halos are merely phantoms of a forgotten age. Massive, unrecognizable orbital rings now encircle the equator, an iron collar of gargantuan shipyards and orbital tether stations that choke the planet in a cage of void-wrought iron. The ecstasy of the bridge crew evaporates into an abyss of geographical confusion. Officers stare in mute horror at a landscape that defies every navigational chart held within their databanks. This is not an invasion. This is an evolution, unnatural and entirely Xenos. The terror that grips Elias is not born of monstrous Xenos horrors or the warp-spawned abominations of the archenemy. It is the sheer, suffocating terror of an environment that is simultaneously intimately familiar and entirely unrecognizable. It is the chilling realization of a chronological anomaly so vast that it crushes the human mind. Elias looks past the orbital rings, seeking solace in the eternal constancy of the stars. Yet the sensory displacement only deepens his nightmare. The constellations themselves have shifted. The celestial tapestry he had memorized as a child has drifted, the stars moving along their galactic arcs in a silent testament to the passage of untold centuries. Time has betrayed them. They have sailed across the warp, only to return to a future that has devoured their past. The silence on the bridge is absolute, a collective gasp caught in the throats of men and women who have become ghosts in their own time. Slowly, beneath the heavy shroud of their creeping despair, the dormant cogitators of the ship begin to hum with newly awakened purpose. The ancient machine spirits stir in the cold dark, reaching out across the void to cast their interrogative pings against this sprawling, unknown orbital grid. The ocular shock of their mutated homeworld quickly gave way to the cold, paralyzing terror of technological obsolescence. Deep within the cavernous bridge of the Emperor's Repose, the Voxmaster and his tethered Lex mechanics worked in a state of frantic synchronicity. They purged their data looms and flooded the local void with their standard cryptographic identification codes. In the grand architecture of the Imperium, a vessel does not simply arrive in a core system unannounced. It must sing the proper binary hymns to the system authorities. This is the sacred dance of the noosphere, an invisible realm of overlapping data where machine spirits commune through highly encrypted data streams. Under standard operational protocols, an arriving ship transmits a complex sequence of authorization ciphers, localized tithe records, and astropathic gene seals. The orbital defense grid's master logic engines receive these digital prayers, cross-reference them against Titanic sector archives, and grant safe passage through the layered minefields and defensive cordons. It is an automated system built on rigid, unchanging paranoia to protect humanity from the horrors of the dark. Yet the Emperor's Repose was a relic entirely out of time. The holy codes they frantically transmitted were formulated millennia ago during an age of relative enlightenment. To the modern Auspex arrays of the defense network, the ship and its crew were archaic ghosts speaking a dead, forgotten dialect of machine code. The systemic rejection was instantaneous and utterly without mercy. The automated sentinels of the orbital grid did not recognize the returning heroes of a glorious era. Instead, the paranoid logic engines saw only an unidentified, colossal mass conveyor bearing unregistered primitive power signatures. The silence of the local void was violently broken by the unseen electronic scream of targeting augers. A multitude of high-intensity auger locks and targeting telemetries suddenly slammed into the Auspex arrays of the Emperor's Repose. The Auspex screens on the ship's bridge flared with blinding critical threat warnings. The sheer scale of the automated peril was beyond anything the ancient command crew could possibly comprehend. When they had originally departed this star system, orbital defense consisted of scattered monitor stations and modest macro-cannon batteries. Now the planet was ringed by a terrifying, impenetrable halo of overlapping star forts, automated torpedo silos, and orbital lance batteries capable of cracking a small moon. These were apocalyptic weapons, forged in an era of endless, grinding war, born of a systemic desperation the crew had never known. The very world they had bled to build was now locking them down in a cage of inescapable crossfire. Every logic gate in the sector had condemned them to imminent destruction as unknown, hostile intruders. The cold machine spirits of their home world had deafened themselves to the ancient clearance protocols, viewing them only as anomalies to be purged. There was no algorithmic salvation left to the frantic bridge crew. The automated orbital systems were mere seconds away from unleashing a concentrated storm of atomic fire. Recognizing that the sacred machine ciphers had utterly failed them, the desperate Voxmaster realized that cold logic would only guarantee their execution. He reached out with a trembling flesh-and-blood hand to bypass the cogitator banks entirely. With the targeting alarms screaming in the background, he disengaged the holy data tethers and keyed open a manual, unencrypted Vox channel, preparing to hurl a raw human plea into the merciless dark. The automated identification ciphers had been purged by the orbital defense grid as dead code. The Voxmaster had no choice but to override the mute machine spirits and open a raw, unencrypted channel. He leaned into the brass caster and spoke a plea for safe harbor in perfect, unblemished low Gothic. His voice echoed across the quiet bridge, offering a desperate tether to the humanity they knew. Then the orbital traffic controllers answered. What flooded the bridge was not the comforting response of Imperial kin. It was a wall of pure auditory horror. The local Vox chatter pouring from the communication trumpets was technically born of high and low Gothic, but it had warped into something fundamentally monstrous. It was a guttural, synthesized barrage of sharply clipped phonemes that struck the ear like shrapnel. The vowel sounds had been utterly flattened, stripped of all human resonance, and replaced with a brutal, percussive cadence. Sentences were constructed in a wildly inverted syntax that defied all grammatical logic. Nouns and verbs bled together into sharp, atonal barks. To the guardsman standing frozen on the command deck, it sounded entirely Xenos. It carried the cadence of Xenos insectoids or the grinding, soulless binary of industrial macro-servitors. Yet the tactical auspex confirmed these were pure human voices. This was the dialect of their own descendants, shaped by millennia of unimaginable isolation and brutal industrial efficiency. The sheer weight of deep time manifested not in ruined monuments, but in the horrifying evolution of their mother tongue. Generations of throat augmentations and cogitator-linked speech patterns had reduced the poetic verses of the Imperium to a binary-infected slang. The crew listened to the frantic chatter of the orbital defense monitors, completely incapable of parsing a single syllable. A cold, suffocating terror gripped the bridge as the reality of their temporal displacement finally took hold. They were standing in the orbit of their own homeworld, yet they could not understand the people of their own blood. Their language had left them behind in the dark of the void. Every burst of static-laced dialogue drove the spike of their isolation deeper into their souls. They were ghosts speaking a dead tongue to a civilization that had forgotten their words. The linguistic chasm was absolute. It was a void far more terrifying than the physical vacuum of space outside their adamantium hull. The Voxmaster wept silently as he adjusted the dials, drowning in an ocean of incomprehensible noise. The proud history of their regiment, the names of their martyrs, and the very prayers they offered to the God Emperor were meaningless here. They had survived the terrors of the warp only to become strangers in their own house. The cacophony threatened to shatter whatever fragile sanity remained among the commanding officers. The captain pushed the trembling Voxmaster aside and seized the primary tuning dials himself. Through sheer desperation, he began to filter the overlapping streams of vocal static. He ignored the rapid staccato bursts of the military Vox channels and the encrypted shrieks of the merchant guilds. He sought the lowest frequency of the administratum bands, searching for a rhythm that possessed the sluggish inertia of ancient bureaucracy. His trembling fingers turned the brass knobs until he isolated a single, agonizingly slow transmission. It was the voice of a low-level orbital clerk droning out endless shipping logs. The static of the crude Vox link finally thinned, replaced by the droning, lifeless hum of the Adeptus Administratum. To bridge the void was not merely to traverse physical space, but to hurl oneself into a bureaucratic nightmare of unfathomable scale. On the other end of the crackling channel sat an orbital scribe of the mid-tier, a wretched creature of parchment and ink whose very soul had been ground to dust by centuries of monotonous tallying. The scribe met their hail with the heavy, exasperated sigh of a man whose petty fiefdom of ledgers had been rudely interrupted. For the scribe, this was merely another irritant in an endless cycle of quotas, tithes, and minor shipping disputes. He demanded their clearance codes with a voice dripping in lethargic apathy. Aboard the drifting vessel, the captain and Elias fought through their own mounting desperation. They tried to explain the impossible to a man who possessed no imagination. They spoke with urgent pride, declaring themselves the surviving elements of the 144th Viridian Regiment. They spoke of the Cadian Gate, of honourable service, and of their long journey home through the turbulent tides of the Immaterium. Through the Vox, the scribe offered only a bored, condescending grunt. To the functionary, they were nothing but anomalous data, a clerical error demanding immediate correction before his shift rotation. The scribe began to enter their ancient, cumbersome serial numbers into his massive brass cogitator. Over the open channel, the heavy, rhythmic clatter of mechanical keys echoed like the ticking of a doomsday clock. The keys struck parchment and punch card with a dull, thoughtless rhythm. Then the rhythm died. The clatter stopped entirely. A chilling, heavy silence fell over the Vox link, thick enough to suffocate the desperate bridge crew. Seconds bled into one another, stretching the quiet into an agonizing eternity. The silence was not merely the absence of sound, but the sudden, terrifying presence of a dreadful revelation. The void itself seemed to hold its breath as the truth manifested on a flickering phosphor screen. When the scribe finally spoke again, the bureaucratic arrogance had been utterly stripped from his throat. His voice was no longer that of a petty tyrant of the archives, but the trembling whisper of a man staring into the abyss. He stammered, his breath catching in his throat, as he begged the captain to repeat their unit designation. He asked the question with the superstitious terror of an underhiver fearing the shadows. The numbers on his terminal defied logic, reason, and sanity. In that suffocating stillness, the clerk understood with horrifying clarity that the serial codes he had just processed belonged to a regiment that had been solemnly declared lost with all hands millennia ago. He realized, with a creeping dread that froze the blood in his veins, that he was exchanging words with phantoms. The warp had not returned living heroes, but wandering ghosts. To comprehend the impossible truth glowing upon his monitor, the terrified scribe knew he must descend into the deepest forgotten vaults of the Imperial data crypts. To understand the horror of the clerk is to understand the labyrinthine madness of the Adeptus Administratum. Beneath the rusted surface of a million worlds lie the deep storage data crypts. These are not mere archives, they are subterranean servers the size of entire continents, buried in perpetual gloom and choked with the dust of forgotten centuries. Here, mindless servitors trudge endlessly along trackways bordered by towering iron shelves. The mechanical retrieval of a single file requires grinding gears, howling pneumatics, and the sacrifice of grueling human toil. In this abyssal repository, the sum of human endeavour is reduced to flickering phosphor and decaying parchment. Across the cold expanse of the void, the terrified clerk manipulated his ancient console. The groan of the deep-crust logic engines echoed through the open Vox channel. Then the telemetry feed stabilized. The clerk relayed the direct visual output of his cogitator screen to the primary oculus on the ship. Before the unblinking eyes of the bridge crew, ancient cathode tubes warmed to life. Glowing green runes crawled across the black glass in pitiless succession. 144th Viridian, status KIA, lost in the warp. Then came the final line, a brutal gut punch delivered with uncaring mechanical precision. Date of loss, 500 standard Terran years prior, 5 centuries. The number hung in the recycled air of the bridge, a suffocating miasma of impossible truth. 500 years is not a delay, it is the passing of an entire epoch. Half a millennium of human history had ground onward while they were trapped in the timeless nightmare of the Imperial. In 500 years, magnificent hive cities are raised to the heavens and subsequently burned to ash. Entire planetary dynasties flourish, grow corrupt, and are purged by the Inquisition. Stars die, whole sectors fall to the Xenos and the heretic. For the crew of the 144th Viridian, 5 centuries of existence had simply been erased. The wives they left behind were long gone. The children they swore to protect had grown old, withered, and crumbled into dust centuries before this ship dropped out of the warp. Their grandfathers were forgotten, their great-grandchildren were dead. They had stepped across the threshold of a localized hell and emerged as phantoms, haunting a galaxy that had long ago inscribed their names on memorial monoliths. A profound, suffocating silence gripped the command deck. The entire crew stood frozen in a state of absolute ontological shock, their reality fundamentally and irreversibly shattered. The human mind cannot easily process its own obsolescence. In the face of such absolute chronological annihilation, military discipline always crumbles. Unable to accept the vast, uncaring void of half a millennium, a solitary figure broke the paralysis. Elias, his face pale and his hands trembling with a sudden, desperate madness, ignored every protocol of his station. He shoved past the frozen officers and threw himself toward an auxiliary terminal. If the regiment was a ghost, he needed to know what the turning of 5 brutal centuries had done to the solitary bloodline he had left behind. Discipline shatters under the crushing weight of an impossible truth. Elias breaks rank, entirely blind to the shouted warnings of his commanding officers. He shoves past the plated bulk of the ship provosts with a manic, hollow-eyed desperation that belongs to a dying beast. He throws himself at a subordinate Lex terminal, his trembling, calloused fingers hammering upon the brass keys with reckless force. He seizes an open Vox mic tethered to the auxiliary logic shrine, furiously broadcasting his Departamento Munitorum identity codes to the terrified orbital scribe. The distant cogitator grinds in protest, its machine spirit sluggish and indifferent as it passes requests from a ghost. It searches the vast labyrinthine databanks of the sector registry, transmitting the cross-referenced planetary archives back to the ship's flickering primary display. He types the names that have kept him tethered to sanity through the screaming madness of 100 war zones. Ilara, Livia, wife, daughter. The phosphor screen flickers into life, casting a sickly, gangrenous glow over his scarred and weeping face. There is no grand, dramatic revelation. There is no blaring klaxon to signify the absolute end of his universe. There is only the cold, sterile, merciless bureaucracy of the Adeptus Administratum. Subject, Ilara. Status, expired. Subject, Livia. Status expired. Tithe exemption. Natural attrition. Record closed 412 standard Terran years prior. Elias stops breathing. His hands shake uncontrollably as he reaches beneath his flak armor, withdrawing the battered picked capture he has guarded more fiercely than his own mortal soul. He stares down at the faded, smiling faces of his beloved wife and his innocent little girl. The truth violently realigns his reality. He is not holding a memory of the living, he is holding a portrait of ancient dust. The tragic irony of his existence crashes down upon him in a suffocating, paralyzing wave of despair. Elias had survived the absolute worst horrors the dark galaxy could conjure. He had endured the flesh-melting orbital bombardments of Xenos invasions. He had held the trench lines against the shrieking, blasphemous aberrations of the archenemy. He had bled, he had starved, and he had killed without hesitation, all to keep the fires of eternal war far from his family. He had waged a lifetime of slaughter simply to keep them safe. Yet while he was frozen in the timeless, churning purgatory of the warp, the most insidious thief of all had bypassed every defense. Time had effortlessly murdered the only things he ever loved. No carapace armor could deflect the silent turning of the centuries. No bayonet or laser could slay the creeping rot of natural decay. His unimaginable sacrifices are revealed as ashes scattered across an uncaring void. The faded picked capture slips from his numb fingers, fluttering to the cold iron decking like a withered leaf. Elias collapses to his knees, his spirit utterly annihilated by a grief too vast for a human heart to contain. The hollow thud of his armor striking the floor sounds like a hammer falling upon a coffin lid. As his broken weeping fills the cramped compartment, a terrible creeping realization bleeds outward from his kneeling form into the surrounding ranks. He is not alone in this temporal graveyard. 3,000 veteran guardsmen stand in absolute, suffocating silence. 3,000 hardened survivors slowly look down at their own hands, feeling the phantom weight of loved ones who have been rotting in the earth for half a millennium. Elias was but one fractured pane in a rapidly shattering mosaic. The devastating personal apocalypse that had just unmade him was replicating itself across the entire vessel. 3,000 hardened veterans of the 144th Regiment were descending into a simultaneous and irreversible psychological collapse. These were men and women who had held the line against the formless nightmares of the warp without ever blinking. Now they were reduced to trembling children before the glowing green screens of the shipboard archival cogitators. Frenzied hands pounded across brass-runed keyboards. Desperate eyes scoured endless lines of cold administratum census data. They frantically sought the names of their beloved wives and their growing sons. They looked for their sprawling ancestral estates and their humble farming collectives. They hunted for any fragment of proof that their brutal sacrifices had purchased a future for the ones they loved. Instead, they found only the crushing indifference of deep time. Their bloodlines were entirely extinct. The families they had bled so terribly to protect had perished of old age centuries ago. The quiet pastoral hometowns they dreamed of returning to no longer existed anywhere but in their memories. They had been brutally paved over and suffocated beneath the sprawling ferrocrete foundations of gargantuan megahabs. Nobody remembered their names. Nobody remembered the world they had sacrificed everything to save or the staggering price they had paid. They had stepped into the churning immaterium as glorious heroes and emerged 400 years later as forgotten ghosts. A profound and paralyzing grief seized the entire regiment. All unit cohesion evaporated in a single devastating instant. The iron discipline that had kept them alive through unspeakable Xenos horrors dissolved into absolute and unyielding despair. Hardened killers fell to their knees on the cold iron decking and openly wept. Decorated officers stared at the bulkheads with dead, unblinking eyes, the terrible weight of their medals suddenly feeling like the chains of a tomb. A haunting and suffocating silence settled over the long metallic corridors of the Emperor's repose. It was a collective, paralyzing despair born of pure agony. It was the crushing realization of 3,000 hardened killers that they were trapped in a galaxy that had mercilessly moved on without them. Their miraculous survival against all odds was not a blessing from the Golden Throne. It was a cruel and deeply intricate curse. They were now a ship of orphans. They were entirely untethered from time and hopelessly adrift in a vast universe that did not care that they lived. Every drop of blood they had spilled and every loyal comrade they had buried had been rendered completely meaningless. The sheer, crushing weight of the centuries pressed down upon their fragile human minds until their will to fight was entirely broken. The great vessel became a flying tomb filled with the living dead. The agonizing chorus of their sorrow echoed through every sealed compartment and vaulted hangar bay. Then the terrible wailing was suddenly pierced by a sharp burst of audio static. The shipwide voxcasters hissed and cracked as they automatically tuned to a strong local frequency. The slumbering automated systems had finally captured a planet-wide propaganda broadcast originating from the world directly below them. The auger arrays of the transport ship flickered to life, catching the ambient signals of the world below. Through the static of decaying vox networks came the chanting of priests, their voices distorted by distance and dogma. The ship's cogitators decrypted the cultural broadcasts of the planetary capital, flooding the bridge with the droning liturgy of the local ministorum. They were not listening to news of their arrival or military commands. They were listening to hymns of their own demise. The men of the 144th Regiment had not merely been recorded as casualties of the warp, they had been canonized. Centuries ago, the ecclesiarchy had gathered the ashes of their disappearance and forged them into a localized religion. Through the crackling speakers, the guardsmen heard zealots praising the glorious sacrifice of the sons of the lost transit. The broadcasts spoke of holy martyrs who willingly gave their souls to the Emperor so that the sector might endure the encroaching darkness. It was a surreal and suffocating horror to hear one's own name chanted as a prayer by descendants who viewed you as a mythical savior. The ship's picked casters displayed the central square of the planetary capital, confirming the auditory nightmare with stark visual evidence. There, towering over the grox-drawn carts and the teeming masses, stood gigantic effigies of stone. They were statues of Elias and his comrades, carved by devout masons who had never seen their true faces. 400 years of corrosive acid rain had smoothed their heroic features into blank, anonymous masks of unyielding piety. The thick soot of countless manufactorums stained their granite armor a deep mourning black. Feral avians nested in the deep crevices of their stony shoulders, covering the sacred monuments in centuries of accumulated filth and droppings. The men stared at the glowing screens, trapped in a paralyzing cognitive dissonance between their mundane reality and their newly discovered divinity. They were looking down at a world where they were legendary, immortalized in the grand, decaying architecture of Imperial faith. Yet they knew the terrifying truth of their own fragility. They were not holy avatars of the God Emperor of mankind. They were tired, terrified mortals trapped in the bleeding, flawed bodies of ordinary men. To be a living relic is to endure a unique and agonizing psychological torture. The Imperium worships the dead, for the dead cannot speak, cannot sin, and cannot contradict the Holy Scripture written over their empty graves. These weary soldiers knew with dreadful certainty that if they were to land on the soil of their home world, they would not be welcomed as returning heroes. Flesh and blood are undeniably messy, prone to fear and heresy, and utterly incompatible with the pristine perfection of ancient myth. To the powerful priests who ruled the world below, the physical return of the sons of the lost transit would not be celebrated as a miracle. It would be a catastrophic heresy that threatened the very foundation of their absolute spiritual authority. Living martyrs are an intolerable abomination to those who profit solely from their silent memory. Guardsman Elias stood entirely motionless before the main viewing port, his pale reflection superimposed over the degraded image of his own colossal statue. The staggering weight of this existential dread crushed whatever fragile hope had miraculously survived their journey through the merciless warp. He realized he was nothing more than a ghost haunting his own towering shrine, staring into the dark abyss of a reality that fundamentally rejected his continued existence. Ilya stares at the faded picked capture resting in his trembling hands, and then lifts his weary gaze to the sprawling world beyond the viewport. It is a tableau steeped in the cruelest dramatic irony. He is looking at a society that worships his memory, yet utterly denies his physical reality. To be a living ghost is an agony that no battlefield trauma can match. He is a man who technically does not exist. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, to die in service to the God Emperor is to become a hero. Death is the expected duty. Martyrdom is the bedrock of the Imperium, a sacred currency that buys the survival of humanity for another day. But to return from the void centuries after your own canonization is to become an abhorrent aberration. Survival of this magnitude is a disruption to the stagnant holy order of the Adeptus Terra. The Administratum has no protocols for the resurrection of the forgotten. Elias is a walking paradox, a glitch in the grand decaying machinery of the imperial tithe. As the reality of his profound chronological isolation sets in, an immense and paralyzing apathy takes hold of his soul. He realizes that he has no barracks to return to, no bed to sleep in. The currency jingling in his pockets has been obsolete for 20 generations, rendered mere historical curiosities lacking all purchasing power. He has no family left to embrace, for his bloodline has either faded into the dust of hive cities or been elevated to mythical, unapproachable heights by the cults that venerate his regiment. He has no commanders to report to because his entire chain of command has been dead and buried for 500 years. He is a profound anomaly, adrift in an empire that has already closed the book on his life and sealed his records with wax. This realization brings a sheer, crushing sense of powerlessness that drives Elias into a pit of absolute nihilism. A guardsman is trained to fight xenos, mutants, and heretics. He is taught how to hold the line against charging beasts and corrupt traitors. But a lasgun cannot kill time. A bayonet cannot stab a 500-year deficit. Tactics and bravado mean absolutely nothing against the relentless march of centuries. Without a single shot being fired, Elias is entirely defeated. The enemy that conquered him is the simple turning of the celestial clock. He sits in the cold belly of the transport, completely paralyzed by the agonizing silence of a grief that has no name. He is mourning his own life while he is still forced to live it. His squadmates sit in similar ruin, statues of flesh condemned to haunt a future that has no place for them. They are trapped in a tomb of their own survival. But the universe is rarely content to let a broken soldier rest in peace. Without warning, the suffocating silence is violently shattered. A harsh, aggressive signal suddenly tears through the atmosphere, forcefully overriding every single system on the ship. The desperate, confused civilian Vox traffic, bleeding through the auger arrays of the Emperor's repose, was severed in an instant. In its place came a signal of terrifying, absolute power that crushed the local communication channels into utter submission. It was a voice entirely devoid of humanity, a cold, mechanical and hyper-authoritative drone that resonated in the very bones of every soul aboard. It issued a single, unyielding command, demanding that the transport ship power down all plasma drives immediately and prepare for supreme compliance. This was no planetary governor or local void enforcer. The towering inquisitorial sigil that burned itself into the ship's primary cogitator screens belonged to a whispered myth. They had attracted the attention of the Ordo Chronos. To understand the gravity of this arrival is to peer into the most secretive and poorly understood branch of the Emperor's Holy Inquisition. The Ordo Chronos is a phantom organization dedicated exclusively to combating temporal heresy and the maddening anomalies born of warp-time distortion. Most servants of the Golden Throne believe time flows only forward. These esoteric inquisitors know the terrifying truth, understanding that the warp can twist chronologies into lethal contradictions. To the Ordo Chronos, a time paradox is never viewed as a tragic accident of warp transit or a mere navigational error. Instead, they perceive such temporal misalignments as deliberate, highly dangerous tears in the very fabric of reality. They know that these chronological wounds act as open, bleeding gateways, beckoning demonic incursions to spill from the immaterium and unravel the local time stream entirely. A displaced timeline is a spiritual infection that must be surgically excised. The Ordo Chronos acts without hesitation or mercy, utilizing prescribed doctrines to amputate the offending anomaly and seal the breach before the ruinous powers can take root. Elias and his surviving men were still paralyzed by the sheer weight of their grief and the crushing realization of their absolute obsolescence. They had fought and bled for a century that no longer existed, rendering their lifetime of sacrifice completely meaningless. Now, to the cold, calculating auger sweeps of the Ordo Chronos, these veteran guardsmen were no longer heroes or even loyal subjects. They were nothing more than biological contaminants. They were living, breathing paradoxes carrying the taint of a displaced era, threatening the divine sanctity of the present moment simply by existing. The Inquisition does not negotiate with chronological aberrations. They arrive with absolute, unquestioning authority, wielding the power of total extermination over planets and void fleets alike. The men of the Emperor's repose could do nothing but listen in horror to the relentless mechanical voice demanding their immediate surrender. Outside the heavily armored viewing ports, the void began to fill with the predatory silhouettes of local system defense squadrons. Commandeered entirely by the iron will of the Inquisition, these rapid strike vessels accelerated on aggressive intercept trajectories. They maneuvered with absolute, ruthless precision, closing the snare to violently box the crippled transport ship in. In the forgotten mythologies of ancient terror, soldiers returning from the abyss were met with the blare of brass bands and the showering of victory laurels. There is no welcoming parade awaiting the survivors of the 144th. There is only the absolute freezing void and the merciless judgment of the Holy Inquisition. Out of the shimmering distortion of augur-baffling fields, 3 obsidian strike cruisers slip into the material plane. They are sleek, unadorned silhouettes against the starlight, predatory leviathans that immediately move to box the Emperor's repose into an inescapable kill zone. No vox hails cross the emptiness to ask how these mortal men survived horrors untold. There are no demands for surrender, nor tearful inquiries regarding their miraculous return. The Ordo Chronos does not negotiate with chronological anomalies. They only establish absolute, unbreakable quarantine. Aboard the crippled transport, warning klaxons begin to scream their mechanical terror. The comforting hum of the ship's void shields abruptly dies as overriding Inquisition clearance ciphers and concentrated bursts of disruption static pulse through the ether. The invisible barriers of energy are violently stripped away, leaving the battered hull completely naked to the cold expanse of space. This is an approach defined by utter, terrifying coldness. It is the methodical preparation of an industrialized slaughter, orchestrated by masters who view human life as a mere rounding error in the great ledger of reality. Deep within the rusted, blood-stained compartments of the Emperor's repose, the veterans simply watch the surveyor screens. These men and women have bled across a dozen nightmare worlds, enduring the ravages of the warp and the endless meat grinder of the Emperor's wars. They have faced horrors that would shatter the minds of ordinary citizens. Yet now they stand emotionally broken, their souls hollowed out by the sheer weight of a paradox they cannot even begin to comprehend. Fingers that reflexively squeeze triggers against Xenos monstrosities and heretical warlords are now far too heavy to lift a single laser gun. They stare at the approaching black ships and realize the ultimate crushing truth of the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. To survive the impossible is not an act of divine providence, but the highest form of punishable heresy. Their own glorious Imperium, the very establishment they gave their blood and sanity to defend, has come to execute them. In the silent vacuum of space, the armored launch bays of the Inquisition cruisers yawn open like the maws of starving void beasts. Plumes of ignited promethium flare brilliantly against the infinite dark. Heavy boarding torpedoes are fired with ruthless mathematical precision, streaking across the enforced quarantine zone. They carry the Emperor's ultimate, unappealable sanction. Inside those metal shells wait heavily armored executioners, holy killers dispatched to cleanse the timeline of a living mistake. The massive adamantine projectiles cross the final distance, locked irrevocably onto the unprotected flank of the doomed and silent transport. The melter charges detonated with clinical precision, tearing open the hull of the battered transport like a festering wound. Through the cooling slag stepped the black-armored elite of the Holy Ordos, their respirators hissing in the dead air. These were not soldiers engaging a hostile military force. Their advance was not dictated by the doctrines of warfare, but by the ruthless protocols of a deep void biological containment purge. They moved as a sterilization team, marching in tight, interlocking formations that left no shadow uncleansed. They simply advanced, burning away the taint of an impossible paradox with the methodical indifference of a Medici adept excising necrotic flesh. Against this tide of unyielding annihilation, there was no defiance. The veteran guardsmen of the anomaly did not raise their lasguns. They did not form barricades or sing hymns of martyrdom as they had done on 100 forgotten battlefields. They were completely and utterly broken. 5 centuries of temporal dislocation, compounded by the soul-crushing weight of their own non-existence, had hollowed them out to the marrow. They sat upon the cold iron decking, their weapons discarded, their faces buried in their scarred hands. Some wept quietly, mourning the lives and families long turned to dust. Others merely stared into the approaching flames with empty, haunted eyes, welcoming the oblivion they had been cheated out of 500 years ago. It was a massacre devoid of malice, and that made it infinitely more tragic. Here were true heroes of the Imperium, men and women who had bled out their youth to hold the line against the encroaching dark. They had held their ground against Xenor's terrors and heretical abominations, surviving a doom that history had already recorded as absolute. Now they were mercilessly gunned down by the very regime they had sacrificed everything to protect. Hellguns whined, punching blinding flash-cauterized craters through flak armor and flesh with deafening repetition. Not a single word of gratitude was spoken. No final rites were offered. As the bodies slumped against the scorched walls, the sickening stench of charred meat and melted ceramite filled the air. The lingering heat of the volley ignited the crumpled yellowed parchment of their honorable discharge papers, reducing their final proof of service to ash. The official seals of the administratum, the singular proof of their sacrifice and their ticket to a peaceful rest, dissolved into a meaningless red slurry. The stormtroopers marched over the charred remains without a downward glance. Their heavy boots stamped bloody footprints into the metal as they cleared deck after deck, leaving nothing but ashes and silence in their wake. The sterilization of the lower decks was absolute, a mathematical equation balanced by mass murder. With the anomaly systematically erased from the troop bays, the path to the command spire lay undefended. The master of this grim harvest could now walk the burning corridors unhindered. The heavy blast doors of the bridge loomed ahead, the final sanctuary for the doomed command staff and their impossible truth. The heavy blast doors of the command bridge sealed shut behind the Inquisitor. They cut off the rhythmic thuds of the systemic purges happening in the lower decks. He stepped forward, his cold gaze settling upon Guardsman Elias, who sat slumped against a shattered auger terminal. The veteran soldier was a hollowed shell of a man staring into absolute nothingness. The Inquisitor did not approach with the fiery zeal of a battlefield preacher. There was no malice in his posture. There was no burning hatred of the heretic, no righteous anger, and no triumphant fury. There was only the terrifying and boundless void of pure, bureaucratic coldness. When he finally spoke, his voice was like the grinding gears of the Adeptus Terra. It was a voice entirely stripped of basic human warmth. You and your regiment have served the Golden Throne with absolute honor, Guardsman Elias. Your campaign records are pristine. Your unyielding loyalty to the Master of Mankind is faithfully noted in the great archives of Terra. But your survival today is a statistical impossibility. The maddening paradoxes born of the Immaterium are absolute and thoroughly unforgiving. A mortal vessel lost to the screaming tides of the warp for 5 centuries does not simply return. It certainly does not return with a perfectly human, biologically uncorrupted crew. The calculated odds of such miraculous preservation are mathematically non-existent. The Holy Ordos cannot and will not accept this return as a natural occurrence. Because your continued purity is mathematically impossible, it can only be a profound trick orchestrated by the ruinous powers. Your very existence in this current millennium is inherently heretical. You are an anomaly standing against the rigid order of the Emperor. The Imperium of man does not tolerate anomalies. If even a fraction of a percent of probability suggests that you carry the insidious taint of the warp, the risk vastly outweighs the value of your innocent lives. Furthermore, your unexpected presence completely contradicts the established historical timeline of this sector. You and your men were officially marked as deceased half a millennium ago. To allow you to live now would introduce an unforgivable chronological error into the administrative perfection of the Lex Imperialis. Correcting this clerical discrepancy is far more important to the stability of the sector than preserving the breath in your lungs. I do not hate you, guardsmen. I do not view you as a traitor or a coward. I view you as a calculation that has catastrophically failed to balance. Imperial logic demands absolute certainty in all things. That certainty is a precious luxury bought only with human blood. Do not weep for the loyal soldiers dying in the corridors beneath our feet. They are not being murdered by my stormtroopers. They are simply being redacted from a ledger where they no longer belong. The grand accounting of history must be balanced perfectly. Your survival leaves a profound, illogical stain upon its sacred pages. I ask you now to accept your ultimate duty to the God Emperor. Elias listened to the clinical execution of his entire world without shedding a single tear. The crushing weight of Imperial logic had completely extinguished the last lingering ember of his humanity. He offered no protest and mounted no final defense. There was only the grim, silent acceptance of the cold mathematics of death. The Inquisitor slowly raised his weapon with the calm precision of an archivist stamping a finalized document. The adamantium bulkhead was cold against the back of Elias. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the last surviving members of his battered crew. There was no weeping among them. There was no screaming or frantic begging for a mercy they all knew did not exist. The Inquisition had spoken its irrefutable and fatal logic. To survive the treacherous tides of the immaterium only to be condemned by the mathematics of a chronochart was a madness too absolute to fight. Elias felt no anger in his final moments. He felt only a profound and suffocating isolation. He turned his gaze away from the black-armored executioners leveling their weapons and looked toward the vast armor-glass viewport. There, filling the void with a sickly amber luminescence, hung Viridia Prime, his corrupted homeworld. The jewel of swirling cerulean oceans, he remembered, had been entirely swallowed by a blackened, hyper-industrialized sphere. It was massive, it was unrecognizable, and it was utterly agonizingly out of reach. For subjective decades of endless war and warp transit, Elias had carried the memory of that sphere in his weary heart. He had sacrificed the vigor of his youth to defend the very Imperium that now held him at gunpoint. He had bled upon forgotten worlds and endured the horrors of the galaxy solely for the chance to breathe the air of his birthplace one last time. Now he was dying on its very doorstep. Only inches of armored glass and the rigid dogma of the Inquisition separated him from salvation. The tragic irony settled over him like a heavy burial shroud. He was not being put to the wall for treason against the Golden Throne. He was not facing the mass-reactive shells of his executioners because of cowardice in the face of the Xenos or the heretic. He was dying for the singular crime of being late. The chaotic currents of the warp had delayed their vessel, returning them to real space long after their official ledger of existence had been closed. The universe had conspired to render his entire life, his unyielding faith, and his countless sacrifices into nothing more than an inconvenient clerical error. The administratum could not abide a paradox. The Inquisition could not tolerate a ghost. Therefore, Elias and his loyal comrades simply had to be erased. The executioners moved with methodical and terrifying precision. Their movements were synchronized and entirely devoid of human empathy. They raised their hell guns to eye level in perfect unison. The dull, metallic sound of weapon safeties disengaging echoed through the silent observation corridor. Elias kept his eyes locked upon the ash-choked orb of Viridia Prime. He imagined the scent of the sweet rain on the highland plateaus. He imagined the warmth of the sun that was currently shining upon the southern hemisphere. The Imperium did not care for his memories. The Imperium cared only for the absolute sanctity of its records and the unbroken purity of its timelines. He took one final breath of stale, recycled ship air. The firing line tightened their grips. The cold, adamantium barrel of the Inquisitor's bolt pistol pressed flush against the temple of Elias. He did not flinch. He did not look up at the faceless stormtrooper towering over him. He did not cast a final defiant glare toward the Inquisitor who had condemned him to oblivion. Nor did he turn his eyes to the viewport to watch the distant dying stars of a galaxy he had sacrificed his soul to protect. Instead, his gaze fell downward. Cradled in his trembling hands was a fragile, cracked piece of plastic. It was the 500-year-old Pict capture of Ilara and Livia, his wife, his daughter. They were dust now, their very memories ground away by the merciless turning of centuries, yet in his final living moment, they were the absolute center of the universe. The deafening roar of the bolt round shattered the stillness of the bridge. It was a catastrophic detonation of mass reactive force, a brutal and instantaneous end to a tragedy 5 centuries in the making. Then there was only the immediate, haunting silence. The absolute quiet of the void reclaimed the space, interrupted only by the wet thud of Elias collapsing to the grated iron deck. From his suddenly slack fingers, the ancient Pict capture slipped free. It fluttered through the stale air like a dying moth, coming to rest in the expanding pool of arterial blood. It was a forgotten relic of a forgotten man, instantly soaked in the lifeblood of a soldier whose only crime was surviving. With the Inquisitor and his kill team having safely withdrawn to their waiting cruisers, the void outside the shattered bridge stirred with lethal purpose. A dozen Inquisition strike vessels maneuvered into firing formation around the Emperor's repose. Without fanfare or hesitation, brilliant beams of blinding white plasma lanced through the darkness. They struck the ancient troop transport with the wrath of a dying sun, bulkheads vaporized. Adamantium spines snapped and melted into slag. The ship, along with the butchered remnants of the 144th, was systematically incinerated. The Inquisition watched with cold, bureaucratic satisfaction as the chronological anomaly was reduced to atomic vapor. The ledger was balanced. The error was excised from reality. In the official archives of the Administratum, the regiment would remain forever classified as lost in the warp, their miraculous return entirely erased from the annals of mankind. There is no salvation in the grim darkness of the far future, not even for the righteous. In the galaxy-spanning domain of the God Emperor, the most hostile, uncaring entity is not the Xenos, nor the mutant, nor the ravenous demons of the Immaterium. It is time itself. Time is a relentless, unfeeling predator that devours worlds and grinds heroes into nothingness. And the Imperium, in its endless, stagnant paranoia, will gladly murder you and everyone you have ever loved, simply to ensure the sacred ledgers remain balanced.